How did the Archean Earth create the first building blocks of life? Or perhaps more truly, what if life did not begin, but emerged slowly, like mist lifting from stone? What if it wasn't built, but remembered, not assembled, but stirred, from something older than atoms? What if the Earth did not create life, but cradled it, in silence, in pressure, in heat and longing? Wherever you are tonight, I'm glad you're here. Let the day fall behind you now. Let thoughts dissolve like salt in ancient oceans. This is a bedtime story from the beginning of beginnings, from a time when there was no time, from an Earth not yet alive, but dreaming, before breath, before eyes, before even silence could echo. There was only heat, not the kind that warms, the kind that forgets, the kind that does not flicker, but devours, a heat that turned oceans to vapour before they were ever born, a heat that erased as it made. The Archean Earth was not a place. It was a process, an endless metamorphosis, a world without crust, without kindness. Not yet a planet that could hold life, but one that had learned how to hold memory. In stone, the surface swelled and broke in waves of molten regret. Iron rained from the skies. Volcanoes bloomed like wounds. And the moon, newborn and distant, still trailing the afterbirth of impact, pulled at the Earth's skin with fingers made of gravity. This was a time without days. Light did not come in intervals. The sun was a presence, not a rhythm. Time had not yet learned how to count. But still, something moved beneath the chaos. Not motion, not intention, a murmuring, a pattern in the noise. The planet did not know what it was doing, but it kept doing it, over and over. It turned itself inside out. Subduction, uplift, collapse. The crust was a dream the mantle could not keep. Each time it tried to settle, it cracked, like memory trying to take root in fever. And yet, within the fever, a rhythm emerged. Tides, not of water, but of rock, a molten ballet of convection. Heat rising, cooling, sinking, rising again, like a breath that hadn't yet found lungs. These tides had no memory. They moved not forward, but in circles, not toward life, not away from it, just around, swelling, collapsing, like a heart that had not yet learned purpose. In the darkness between eruptions, minerals began to form. Crystals grew without eyes. Basalt spread its fingers across the surface, cooling just long enough to forget its fire. And in these moments of stillness, the planet took its first shallow breaths. Not air. Not yet, but pauses. Between the chaos there were pauses. Moments when the surface cooled enough to crust over like sleep on water. Thin, temporary, dreamlike. The moon pulled harder, its gravity a lullaby for magma, creating not oceans, but intention. A push, a pull, a subtle coercion of the Earth's skin. This is how rhythm began. Not in music, in pressure. Not in time, in repetition. And from rhythm came possibility. Not life, not yet, but the shape in which life could one day fit, because nothing stays molten forever. Even rage cools. Even a planet must rest. And when it did, when the surface curled into itself like ash, the first rocks were born. Not lifted, but exhaled. Not carved, but allowed. Zircon, oldest of all witnesses, formed quietly in these moments. A crystal of memory, its atoms locked in patterns that could outlast continents. It did not think, but it remembered. Traces of oxygen, hints of liquid water, echoes of collisions long vanished. Zircon remembers what Earth cannot, because Earth does not remember. It becomes, and it became again and again, until something unfamiliar took root. A crust that did not fall away, a silence that lasted longer than a breath, a surface that no longer boiled, but whispered, and in that whisper, the Earth began to hold, to cradle, to keep, not life, not yet, but the conditions of its arrival, a stillness beneath which something ancient began to stir, something patient, something small, something that would not bloom for eons, but was already waiting. Because even in a world of fire, some truths are too heavy to burn, and what the planet buried, it never truly forgot. Heat was not the enemy. It was the sculptor, not a hand, but a pressure. Not a flame, but a persistence. A gentle, violent coaxing from disorder into pattern. Every atom in the newborn Earth was restless, but not aimless. They danced, and like all dances, there was rhythm beneath the chaos. Even in the seething mantle, something waited to fall into place. Silicon, oxygen, aluminum, they rose in plumes. They cooled in silence. They collided not with fury, but with repetition. And repetition, no matter how blind, can become memory. The moon watched all this from afar, its orbit still chaotic, its own face still molten with regret. But already it had become a mirror, not of light, but of longing. It pulled at Earth's skin, and the skin trembled, and in that trembling, order stirred. Beneath the surface, convection cells twisted like forgotten thoughts. One rose, another fell, deep currents of rock cycling endlessly, never sleeping, never speaking, but forming the pulse of the planet. These pulses shaped the crust, not like a sculptor's chisel, but like the sea-shaping stone, slow, patient, indifferent. They did not create continents. They created the possibility of continents. This was not design. It was allowance. The Earth was not planning for life. It was not planning at all. It was becoming. And becoming is slow. It is not a line. It is erosion, a gentle wearing away of what doesn't last, until only the essential remains. In the Archean, the essential had not yet emerged, but it was circling, waiting in the heat, in the cracks, in the shadows of things not yet born. The crust thickened, only slightly. It floated atop the mantle, like skin on soup, fragile, trembling, momentary. But in that thinness was the beginning of boundaries, and boundaries, even broken ones, create inside and outside. They allow for difference, for contrast, and with contrast comes identity. Not yet life, but a place for life to one day ask, where do I end? Where do I begin? The rocks of the Archean did not speak, but they held the future in their silence. Granite swelled in plumes from below, basalt crusted in thin black memories, and in these newborn stones, elements began to settle, not by will, but by weight. Iron sank, silica floated, and in that slow segregation, the earth began to sort itself into layers, not like a plan, like a forgetting, like the way water forgets the path it took to the sea. The core, the mantle, the crust, they were not built. They drifted into being, each one a song of pressure and pause. Above it all, the air was no comfort. There was no breath yet, only exhalation, a haze of gases pushed from the Earth's interior, steam, carbon dioxide, ammonia, all the bones of future oceans and future lungs. But now they floated in stillness, thick as memory, lightless as morning, and the sky was not blue. It was the colour of waiting, the colour of ash, of light trying to find a path, of stars veiled behind centuries of vapour. Still, light reached the surface, and when it struck the cooling crust, some minerals shimmered, some atoms leapt, photons whispered to electrons, and though no one was listening, the message was clear. Change is possible, not evolution, not yet, but instability, and in instability, a chance, because the Earth's surface was not still. It fractured, it shuddered, it birthed rifts like sighs, it drowned itself in lava, then hardened again like forgetting. Each moment of stillness was temporary, but temporary was enough, long enough for rain to fall, long enough for steam to cool, long enough for the first drops of true water to kiss the hot rock and vanish into hiss and memory, and then come again, over and over. The tides of water were still forming, still gathering their weight from comets and vapour, but already they longed for gravity. Already the moon's pull stirred not just the rock, but the possibility of oceans, and in that possibility the planet became quiet, not peaceful, not gentle, but quieter, just enough for the first molecules to begin to wonder what else could be true. Not life, not yet, but the pause before the word. Not all silence is absence. Some silence is gestation, and in the deepening hush of the Archean, after the fury of molten dawn, something began to settle. Not peace, but pattern. The earth, having torn itself open again and again, began to cool in fragments, not as a whole, never as a whole, but here and there patches of stillness, like snowflakes melting on fire. And in those patches, minerals grew roots, feldspar, quartz, olivine, pyroxene, names that would come long after. But the forms, the crystalline habits, the quiet devotion to repetition, those were already present. Crystals do not think, but they do remember. Each angle a testimony to the conditions that shaped them. Each lattice a ghost story of heat and pressure. And across the crust, a mosaic of memory began to emerge. A memory not of life, but of conditions. The kind of heat that almost allowed. The kind of pressure that nearly released. Not permission, but suggestion, because life did not arrive with fanfare. There was no first spark. No single moment to praise or carve into myth. There was only accumulation, repetition, persistence. And Earth, though still violent, still fractured, still wrapped in atmosphere thick with forgetting, had begun to persist. The tides, once made only of molten stone, found new currents in the cooling crust. Plates rudimentary, stumbling, drifted against each other like thoughts in sleep. They collided, subducted, rose again, and in those folds of pressure, mountains lifted into skies that no eyes had yet been born to see. Rain fell on them, steam rose from them, and in the cracks between, minerals mingled, not chemistry with intent, but chemistry with rhythm, the beginnings of cycles, not loops, but spirals, not purpose, but recurrence, because recurrence is a kind of invitation, a whisper, not a command. Try again, and the earth did. Over and over, it tried again. Rain fell. Rocks fractured. Elements dissolved. Silicates wept their ions into pools. Iron rusted in breathless shadows. There was no biology to shape these things, but there was time. And time, given long enough, becomes an architect of chance. In shallow basins carved by heat and gravity, tiny molecules began to form. Chains of carbon, loose and fragile, coated with silence. Amino acids, maybe. Precursors to structure. Fragments of what would one day be called code. Not yet folded into anything stable. Not yet self-replicating. But hovering at the edge of becoming, they clung to mineral surfaces, mica sheets, clays, crystalline faults, as if the rock were a womb. And perhaps it was. Not a place to grow, but a place to hold, to shelter, to endure. Because in the Archean, to endure was everything. Nothing yet lived. But already, something resisted unmaking. And in that resistance, a new silence was born. One no longer empty. But waiting, the moon still watched. Its orbit now more regular, its pull a more faithful hymn. And though the oceans were still assembling, from vapour, from comet ice, from hydrogen born in stars long dead, the rhythm of tides had begun. Tides in rock, tides in heat, tides in chemistry, all pulled by the same invisible thread, gravity's longing, and through it all, the earth turned. One full rotation every few hours, a day so short, it could barely hold a dream, but still it turned. And each turn was a chance, each dusk, a forgetting, each dawn, a rehearsal, because the Archean Earth wasn't building life. It was learning how to hold space for it. And space, as any womb knows, is not just emptiness. It is patience. It is protection. It is the willingness to become what you are not, so something else might arrive. So the planet waited, cooled, shifted, fissured, and in the cracks between its memoryless tides, the first whispers of inheritance began to gather. Nothing was sudden, not even the miracles. Even now, with oceans unborn and the sky still blind, the earth was preparing, not by creation, but by erosion. by giving up what it could not hold and keeping what endured. The crust, thin as sleep, stretched and strained across the convecting mantle. There were no continents, only rafts of stone, adrift upon the molten breath of the planet's interior. Yet even these unstable land masses held secrets in their fractures, hydrothermal vents, fissures where the ocean would one day inhale, were already forming deep beneath the surface in shadowed silence. Places where heat did not destroy, but transformed. There, in that pressurized dark, minerals bled into superheated water, and water carried their offerings into the unknown. Iron, sulfur, carbon, each atom a traveller, each element a promise, waiting to be remembered. No life drifted here, not yet. But the architecture of habit was taking form. Walls of chimneyed stone, porous with possibility. A maze of mineral caverns, ready to cradle complexity, before complexity had a name. And in that readiness, Earth became more than rock, more than fire and crust and plume. It became invitation, not to something certain, but to something fragile, something reversible, because life, at its beginning, was a risk, not a spark, but a balance, and almost the Archean Earth offered no promises, only conditions, cycles of hydration and drying along coastal rocks, tidal flats barely existing, where molecules concentrated, then scattered, then concentrated again, clay minerals with negative charges, attracted strands of carbon, not knowing what they were teaching. They taught repetition, taught adhesion, taught the chemistry of staying close, of trying again after chaos. And slowly, across centuries of failures, something stayed. Not life, but form. A molecule that did not dissolve. A chain that bent but didn't break. A loop that closed itself. These were not organisms. They were tendencies. But tendencies, given enough time, become inevitabilities. And the Earth, through tides of forgetting, kept allowing the same gestures. Fall, rise, bind, break, again and again, until even molecules began to remember what the tides could not. There is no monument to this, no fossil of the first replication, no mark carved into stone to say, this is when it began, because beginnings like this do not arrive like thunder. They seep, they blur, they weave themselves into silence so completely that no line can be drawn. But still, something crossed over. A molecule bent into itself in just the right way, copied part of itself, not perfectly, but well enough, and the world did not notice. But it changed, because from that moment, Earth no longer held only chemistry. It held continuity, not just molecules, but memory, the faintest echo of what came before. The tide, once without memory, now carried something forward, and forward, even in the smallest degree, was enough. Enough to tilt the future, enough to open the door. But the door did not lead to light. Not yet. It led deeper, into vent fields, into mineral hollows, into the logic of carbon's language, into the silence that teaches before it speaks. Because what the planet buried, it never truly forgot, only folded it beneath newer silences, waiting, holding, becoming, and the tides, though they did not know, carried that burden well. Tides with no memory fades now, not with a conclusion, but with a question that eroded too slowly to be heard. What does it mean to remember without knowing? And in the pause between that question and the next, the Earth turns, not forward, but inward, toward the storm that came next. It did not begin as rain. It began as vapor, screamed from vents, spilled from cracks, exhaled from a mantle still haunted by fire. Steam rose not in wisps, but in veils, endless, ash-coloured veils that wrapped the Earth in mourning. The planet had stopped burning, but it had not yet begun to cool. Its breath was still fevered, its skies thick with forgetting, and yet the clouds gathered, not all at once, but slowly from volcanic exhalations, from cometary gifts, from the hydrogen in Earth's own skin, falling in love with borrowed oxygen, They gathered like grief, layer upon layer, until the sky forgot to be sky. There was no blue, only pressure, only weight, only a heaviness that thickened century by century until the heavens broke. And when they did, they broke completely. The first rains came not as droplets, but as floods of sorrow. They fell for centuries without rest, carving into a crust that could not understand them. It was not erosion, it was baptism. Water met rock, and neither would ever be the same. The air turned to liquid. The liquid turned to oceans, but not all at once. Some fell on hot stone and rose again, trapped in a cycle of unknowing. Some pooled in fractures, black puddles of memory, soaking into dust, that had never known softness. The rain fell through lightning, fell through methane, through carbon dioxide thick enough to silence thunder. It fell without mercy, but it also fell with purpose, because water is not passive. It moves, it carries, it dissolves, and in dissolving, it changes everything it touches. The earth, still fragile in its crust, still shivering from its birth, could not resist. It opened its scars to the downpour. Its minerals leached into runoff. Its elements learned to drift. And chemistry, so long confined to fire and pressure, was now free to roam. In that wetness, something shifted. Atoms once locked in stone were now adrift in pools. Carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, all loosened, all set in motion, not toward life, not with intention, but with possibility, because water is not simply liquid, it is invitation. It holds, it stirs, it gathers what would otherwise remain alone. And in those ancient rains, the earth became a basin for every forgotten thought the universe had ever whispered. They pooled in shallow hollows, ponds that steamed at their edges, but cooled at their cores. And into these pools, light fell, sometimes, when the clouds thinned, when the mist parted, ultraviolet, ionizing, destructive, but also creative, for light, like water, can rearrange. And when light touched those drifting atoms, it whispered again, not words, but rearrangements, new bonds, new shapes, rings of carbon, chains of sugars, the skeletons of future thoughts, assembled by accident. They did not last long, but neither did they vanish completely, because the rain kept falling, washing away what failed, leaving behind what almost worked, and almost, in the language of time, is enough, because the rain did not fall for a day, or a year, or even 1,000. It fell for eons, without pause, without memory, without intention. And yet, within it, the raw ingredients of consciousness were gathering, fragment by fragment. Earth did not notice. It had no eyes to see, no language to name. But the ponds grew richer, the lakes deepened, the oceans, one drop at a time, came into being, not as destinations, but as vessels. They did not reflect the sky. They were the sky, collapsed, condensed, made visible, and through them the planet cooled, not evenly, not gently, but enough. Enough for the crust to stop tearing, enough for the air to clear, if only slightly, enough for chemistry to slow down, just long enough to hold its shape. And in that slowing, the first soft patterns took root, not life, but the prelude to it, held in the wet hands of a planet, finally beginning to remember how to rest. The rain did not ask permission. It simply arrived, and kept arriving. A whisper turned waterfall, a drizzle that became deluge. But even deluge can be soft, when stretched across 1,000 centuries. There were no rivers yet, but water flowed, carving its questions into unready stone. Not fast, not loud, but always moving. It followed gravity, that ancient compass, filling lowlands, lapping at volcanic shores, washing through basalt fields, still warm from the breath of the mantle. The earth, once aflame, began to glisten, not from light, from surrender, and where the crust surrendered, pools formed, shallow, scalding, mineral-rich. The first cradles, not for life, but for assembly, because rain, when it falls long enough, doesn't just quench, it curates. Every drop that fell carried more than water. It carried context. It carried collision. It carried the memory of every molecule it had ever touched. And in the flooded basins, those memories mingled: cyanide, formaldehyde, carbon-based ghosts that would be toxic today, but were, back then, promises unspoken. They met under a sky the colour of copper, thick with methane, humming with static. And when lightning fell through it, the sky cracked open like an egg, and inside that moment, new molecules emerged, not alive, but no longer random, strings of nucleotides, half-formed, fatty acids, floating aimless, but dreaming of shape. The air smelled of sulphur and ozone, the ground hissed with steam, but still the rain came. And still the molecules drifted, down, inward, closer. It was not a miracle. It was a tide, a slow drawing in, a slow settling down. And in those pools, evaporation became a sculptor. The sun, when it could pierce the cloud-thick sky, would coax the water upward, leaving behind the concentrated residues of everything that could not rise. And so, over time, in these tidal flats and warm lagoons, the prebiotic world grew rich, not with purpose, but with potential. And potential, given silence, becomes invitation. These pools were no longer just wet. They were thick, viscous with complexity, dark with chemical memory. And in that darkness, the first boundaries were imagined. Fatty molecules, battered by waves, self-assembled into circles, not walls, but skins, not commands, but suggestions, miscells, protocells, bubbles that lasted seconds, then minutes, then longer, not because they wanted to, but because they could. And the rain, still falling, still soft, still endless, pushed more molecules into those bubbles. Accident, over and over, becoming something more than accident, because when a boundary forms and a pattern survives inside it, a story begins. Not one that can be read, not yet, but one that can be passed on. And the earth, without knowing, became a storyteller. Each bubble, each film, each lipid-wrapped whisper was a stanza, half erased, half formed, no meaning yet, but rhythm, a rhythm shaped by tides and heat and the rain that never stopped. This was not evolution. This was rehearsal. The same molecules, trying again, failing again, folding again, held in the cupped hands of a planet that had learned how to cool, but not yet how to speak. And still the rain came, as if it knew that life would need oceans, and oceans would need time, and time, the slowest architect, was still building its scaffolding, one drop, one bond, one silence at a time. The world was not quiet, but it had learned how to hold stillness, not peace, but potential. Each raindrop struck the crust with history, not its own, but the memory of stars long dead, of collisions that birthed this pale blue shadow before blue had ever been born. Hydrogen from ancient nebulae, oxygen released from stone. Their union, simple, volatile, became the Earth's most sacred rhythm: condense, fall, dissolve, return. And it returned. Always it returned. The rain, infinite in its patience, carved patterns into patterns, not rivers, not yet, but grooves, indentations, the gentle erosion of possibility, because the surface was still young, its scars fresh, its fractures open. There were no trees, no roots to hold the soil, only stone and ash and longing, and the longing ran downhill. Pools merged, lakes deepened, shorelines formed from nothing but persistence. And in these rising waters, chemistry thickened, not cleaner, not purer, but richer, wider, a chaos of molecules, drawn together by chance and kept together by time. The oceans were not blue, they were dark, brown and green and iron red, a soup stirred by tectonics and flavoured by lightning. No oxygen yet, no wind in any modern sense, only clouds above and heat below, and between them, the hush of waiting. But inside that hush, the story kept whispering forward. Somewhere in a shallow sea, a strand of RNA folded itself into a shape that could hold itself together. Not life. Not yet, but a gesture toward it. A structure that could persist. And then, in rare moments, perhaps copy. Not perfectly, never perfectly. But even error is a kind of creativity. In fact, error was the first artist, and water, with its softness, its slowness, its refusal to stop, was the brush. Everything was dissolved. Everything was connected. Everything drifted. But some things stuck, bound to minerals, cradled in clay, protected by bubbles that did not know they were membranes. And inside those fragile boundaries, light and shadow conspired, because even under thick skies, light could slip through, scattered, diffused, filtered through methane veils, but still it touched the surface. And where it touched, it broke bonds, made radicals, gave chaos new directions. The surface became a canvas, and light drew on it with fire. Each photochemical accident, a stanza, each molecular loop, a line of ancient code, written not with ink, but with interaction. The oceans, no longer just collectors, became composers, layered melodies of solutes and ions, of acids and bases in equilibrium so delicate that silence itself was a necessary ingredient. And the rain kept the tempo. Drop by drop, it rewrote the crust, smoothed mountains, deepened basins, changed the very composition of rock, until even the land was flavoured with water's memory. And water remembered everything. It had no choice. It took everything in, carried everything forward. No molecule too small, no compound too fleeting. All were invited. All were kept, not alive, not yet, but already becoming difficult to unmake. The earth had no idea what it was doing. It didn't need to. Creation does not require intention, only conditions, only time, only the willingness to try again and reign. The most persistent gesture in the history of the earth was willing. It had always been willing. Even now, it still falls. Not with fury, but with memory. Even now, it whispers the same question to every surface it touches. Will you hold this a little longer? By now, the planet had begun to glisten, not with beauty, but with burden. Its surface, once molten, now softened into story. The oceans were no longer gathering. They had arrived, not with waves, but with weight. They pressed down upon the crust, pulling the heat from it, filling every basin, every scar, and the earth held them, clumsily, but completely. These were not calm seas. They boiled in places, steamed in others. They hissed where lava still reached out, from beneath the skin of the world, but they endured, and endurance is where life begins. For what is life, if not the refusal to leave? The insistence on remaining, even when the world has not made room. And water remained. It sloshed against volcanic islands, carving them smaller. It ran in sheets over plains of basalt, pulling elements from stone, with fingers made of dissolution. The rain, once separate from sea, now became its breath, evaporating, condensing, returning, a closed loop of forgetting. And in this forgetting, cycles began. The first, carbon cycles, the whisper of nitrogen, phosphates pooling in quiet corners, like forgotten seeds. Everything moved in circles now, not yet stable, not yet efficient, but enough for repetition, enough for chance to wear grooves into nature until even chance looked like design. And deep within the oceans, somewhere near a vent or in a shallow tidal flat, the first boundary became a habit, a bubble that held its shape, then another and another, inside them, chains of molecules that resisted dissolution just long enough to copy themselves. Then again, then slightly better. The first inheritance was not of genes, it was of chemistry, of structures that worked, passed on, not by purpose, but by persistence. They were not alive, but they survived. And survival, long enough, become something else. These bubbles, protocells, shells of lipids and longing, began to collect memories, not thoughts, not feelings, but patterns, favors, reactions that led to more reactions, energy caught in loops, tiny engines that didn't know. They were engines, and through it all, the rain kept falling, not to nourish, not to bless, but simply because that is what rain does. It falls, and in falling, it connects what could not touch. The earth was not aware, but it was ready. It had been preparing for this. Across millions of years of silence, the crust had thickened, the oceans had cooled, the sky had calmed, just enough to let light in, without destroying what it found. And what it found, at last, was something that could hold itself together, something that could take in energy, spend it, and survive. Not a cell, not yet, but its rehearsal, its ghost, its blueprint, drawn in molecules that had never known stability. Until now, all of it, every molecule, every fold of membrane, every fragile loop of self-copying chains, was made possible by the rain which asked for nothing, which gave everything, which fell for 1,000 centuries, so that a single pattern might rise. It is still falling. In puddles, in oceans, in the corners of leaves, in the lungs of sleeping children. It remembers, not in words, but in motion, because nothing forgets like water, and nothing remembers like it either. Its journey never ends. It only deepens. And the oceans it left behind, the first cradles of life, are still rocking us, still whispering, still waiting for us to listen. The rain fades, not with an end, but with a breath, one that turns now toward the sky it shaped, a sky that once forgot how to be blue. The sky was not always a place for light. It was once a veil, thick and trembling, woven from the breath of a world still exhaling, not air, not yet, but a soup of gas and memory, the colour of forgetting, of ancient flame, cooled just enough to speak. It held no blue, only weight, only presence, a ceiling of silence that turned sunlight into haze and shadow into shelter. Methane, ammonia, carbon dioxide, hydrogen sulfide, each molecule drifting upward like ghosts leaving stone, and above it all, a sun that burned too brightly for a world that could not yet blink. There was no ozone, no protection, no softness in the light that fell, only ultraviolet knives, sharp and patient, sculpting molecules not with gentleness, but with precision. The sky was not a window, it was a crucible, and the earth, beneath it, trembled quietly, cradling the slow chemistry that still dared to gather. The oceans stirred beneath clouds that never cleared, clouds that were not clouds, but smoke, mist, exhalations too dense to float, and, in their density, a paradox formed. The light that reached the surface was broken, scattered, filtered through layers of gas that bent it, warped it, and slowed it down. But in that scattering, a new alchemy began, because even poison, given patience, can become a teacher. And methane, so volatile, so simple, absorbed the sun's fury and held it like a secret. The sky grew warmer, not from fire, from insulation, a greenhouse before the garden, a blanket over coals. The planet did not freeze. It could have, should have, but the sky held in its heat, like a memory it refused to release. This is how forgetting became survival. In the chemical tangle above, light found a way, not just to break, but to build. Photons shattered bonds, and the fragments rearranged themselves. Free radicals danced in the vapor, reaching, colliding, forming new chains from broken promises. Hydrogen escaped, the lightest of all, slipping past gravity's grasp and drifting into space like a sigh. But what remained grew heavier, complex, and Earth, cloaked in its murky veil, began to change not just at the surface, but from above. The sky was shaping life before life could name it, because chemistry does not need permission to become memory, just conditions, just silence, just time, and the Archean sky had all three. Its clouds hung low, pressed against the ground, like old thoughts that could not lift themselves. Thunder was constant. Electricity surged through the atmosphere, in flashes too quick to witness, but not too quick to matter. Each bolt a rewriting, each flash a spark that never started fire, but often started form. Molecules formed, broke, and formed again, writing the first grammar of life in the hidden creases of vapor, not in words, but in structure. In probability, the air was not breathable, but it was alive in its own way, alive with rearrangement, alive with instruction, and below, in tidal pools and vented seas, those instructions drifted down, like pollen, from a storm the earth never saw coming. There was no blue, there were no stars, only a low ceiling of possibility, and a quiet world below, stirring slowly into awareness. The sky was heavy, it pressed downward, not with force, but with forgetting, a weight not of gravity, but of gases that lingered too long in the afterglow of creation. There was no breath in it, only residue, only remnants of reactions, from a world still finding its shape. Ammonia whispered to methane, carbon dioxide wove through steam, and all of it hung suspended, thick as oil, thin as dreams, a fog that never rose, a ceiling with no stars. Above it all, the sun kept shining, younger, weaker, but relentless. Its light fell not like blessing, but like question. What will you do with this? What will you become? And the atmosphere, though blind, began to answer, not with words, not with life, but with change. In the high altitudes where molecules broke apart, radicals were born, fragments, charged and restless, looking for something to hold. They held each other. They held carbon. They built rings and chains, fragile scaffolds that drifted downward, on currents no one yet called wind, and in the oceans below, those drifting structures fell, like ash, not grey, but molecular, rich with carbon, ripe with possibility. The sky had become a forge, and Earth's seas the receiving ground. Each layer of the atmosphere, a different kind of instruction. Each altitude, a different kind of silence. High above, ultraviolet light burned too bright. Below, in the thickening haze, photons wandered sideways, stripped of energy, but not of influence. It was not gentle, but it was effective, because even chaos, given enough time, finds a rhythm. And the Archean sky, for all its thickness, for all its choking haze, began to organize, not by design, but by erosion, of energy, of heat, of extremes. It was never still, but it became steady, and in that steadiness, light began to penetrate, just barely, through cracks in the clouds, reaching the ocean's skin in broken, trembling strands. Sunlight, filtered through poison, still held the seeds of change, and the molecules in the water, those precursors, those fragments of future cells, absorbed what they could. Photons struck carbon rings, electrons leapt, new reactions unfolded. In the shallows, where warmth met memory, photosynthesis had not yet awakened, but the invitation was already being whispered. Light could feed, if something could learn to take it in, without breaking, without dying. The first pigments began to form, not for colour, but for survival. Chromophores that absorbed harsh light, that kept fragile structures from unravelling. They were shields, but every shield, in time, becomes a doorway, because to block something is to know its shape, and to know it is to begin to use it. The sky, in its blindness, was teaching vision, not to eyes, not yet, but to molecules that would one day become vision's root. And so, beneath the copper veil, beneath the clouds that knew no blue, the language of light was slowly being learned, not spoken, not even understood, but absorbed, trial after trial, chain after chain, structure after broken structure, refined itself. In the heat between photons and tide, nothing was alive, but everything was listening. Even now, the remnants of that listening persist. In the molecules that make leaves green, in the pigments behind every pupil, in the DNA that still spirals, with a rhythm, first taught by sunlight, piercing the haze. The sky did not know, but it remembered. Its memory is not visual. It is chemical. It is spectral. It is a ghost of fire, folded into water, through nothing more than time. And time, as always, asks no questions. It only waits. There is a kind of silence that floats. It does not fall like rain. It does not settle like ash. It lingers, held aloft by pressure and time. The Archean sky was full of it. A silence so thick it hummed. A silence born not of peace, but of too many gases with nowhere else to go. Methane sighed in long exhalations. Carbon dioxide crowded every breathless pocket. Hydrogen leaked from the planet's veins, drifting upward, until gravity let it go, and still the sky darkened. Not with shadow, but with the slow accumulation of possibility. There were no stars at night. There was no night, only a dim, unchanging dusk, where blue could not be born. The sun was smaller then, younger. Its heat was gentle compared to now, but the Earth needed more. By all reason, the planet should have frozen. The oceans should have turned to glass, the pools to permafrost, the molecules to silence. But they didn't, because the sky forgot to be blue, and in that forgetting, it remembered something else. Heat, held like breath in cupped hands, trapped beneath a methane veil, woven dense by volcanic song. The greenhouse was not a human mistake. It was Earth's first kindness. Its first forgetting that made becoming possible. And so the warmth stayed. And in that warmth, the oceans churned, not calmly, but constantly. Waves rolled beneath the copper sky, lifting ancient molecules in their froth, lipids, forming and breaking, amino acids, seeking partners, nitrogenous bases, scattered like seeds across saltwater wind. These were not accidents anymore. They were rehearsals. The sky sent light, still filtered, still fierce. The sea answered with chemistry. Somewhere in the shallows, a strand of something fragile folded inward, held itself just long enough to be touched by another. They linked, then split, then linked again, not with design, with rhythm, because even in the earliest atmospheres, where no eyes watched, no hands shaped, no mind dreamed, patterns learned how to survive. And survival, though blind, is its own kind of intelligence. The sky did not offer clarity, it offered continuity, a slow and steady light, a shield of haze, a rain that never stopped whispering. And Earth, from beneath that veil, began to gather language, not words, not thoughts, but structure, sequences that copied themselves, membranes that held just long enough. And from above, new gifts kept falling, molecules stitched in lightning, complexity born in the high electric layers, tholins, they're called now, prebiotic haze, tiny, organic shadows, raining down from a sky that knew no colour but knew how to change. They drifted into the sea like dust, brown, sticky, impossible to trace, and in their descent they fed the soup of becoming, because in the Archean world, everything was becoming. Nothing was finished, nothing complete. But the sky was tireless, not a ceiling, a womb, holding pressure, holding heat, holding the early poems of molecular memory until they were strong enough to echo on their own. And when at last the haze thinned, for an hour, a moment, a heartbeat, sunlight struck the ocean's surface, like a question, and in that light, something opened, not a cell, not yet, but the threshold to it, and the answer was, yes. The sky had no colour, but it had memory, not of sight, but of light, of the way photons scattered, of the way they carved new shapes in air too dense for vision. It remembered pressure, it remembered collision, it remembered every molecule that dared to break apart, just to find a better shape. It was not kind, but it was generous, in the way that time is generous, by offering endless chances and forgetting the failures. And below this sky, The Earth took those chances, again and again, until some of them began to stay. The haze held warmth. The warmth held oceans. The oceans held molecules. And the molecules, against all odds, began to fold. Folding is the first gesture of memory, the first movement that says, I am not like the world, I am something within it. Separate, shaped. Proteins were still a dream, but their shadows danced in the earliest peptides, chains of amino acids, linked not with meaning, but with persistence. They curled, looped, snapped apart, and rejoined. Some broke, some lingered, some moved. And movement, however slight, is a prophecy, because only what moves can one day search. Only what shifts can one day remember. Above them, the sky kept changing. Slowly, its gases altered by the life they had helped to begin. Life did not rise from air, but it changed air just by existing. Methane exhaled by early microbes thickened the haze, made the sky even more forgetful, even more sheltered. But that, too, was a kindness, because without blue, without brightness, the world remained protected. Ultraviolet light still struck the upper layers, but it burned away in silence. Down below, life unfolded in shadow, quiet, unbothered. The first stromatolites grew in the shallows, mat upon mat of microbial film, layered like silt, like pages in a book no one had yet begun to read. Cyanobacteria, tiny, ancient architects. The first breathers of oxygen, but not yet enough to clear the sky. Their work was slow, like wind on stone, like thought beneath sleep. But it mattered, because every photon they caught became energy, and every molecule they rearranged was a sentence in the long poem of becoming. They built no cities, no bones, no songs, only the conditions for all those things. And the sky, the thick, blank sky, absorbed the evidence. The oxygen they released was swallowed by iron, rusted into stone, locked away. It would take billions of years for that rust to fill, for the sky to clear, for blue to be born. But already the transition had begun. Not in the heavens, in the water. The oceans were changing, their chemistry shifting in response to what life left behind. More order, more structure, more echoes. And when the light touched them, when sunlight pierced the veil, just enough to glint on a wave, the reflection carried with it a trace of what would come. Not blue, not yet, but the feeling of it, the promise of clarity, of openness, of something not heavy, but expansive. Because every act of becoming is also a letting go. And slowly the earth was letting go of its fire-born haze, letting go of the gases that once protected it, but now only muffled its future, letting go of the silence that had cradled its first songs. The sky was still not blue, but it was changing, and change, no matter how slow, is the language of life. The haze did not vanish. It folded back, curled inward, became the breath of those who shaped it. And one day, when enough rust had been buried, when enough microbes had spoken in oxygen, the sky would remember its colour. But for now, it waited. And in that waiting, the world turned softly toward a deeper silence. The silence of vents, of pressure, of life beginning. In the places light could not reach. Somewhere far below the surface, beneath the lightless tides, where the rain never reached, and the skies forgetting could not fall, there was a silence, older than breath. It did not echo. It did not move. It held pressure, held heat, held time like a secret. Here in the ocean's hidden belly, on the ridges of a crust still forming, chimneys rose from the seafloor, not made by hands, but by hunger. Vents, black smokers, alkaline seeps, mouths that did not speak, but gave endlessly, not fire, but chemistry, not light, but potential. In these underwater shrines, the earth exhaled minerals into water, so rich, so heavy, it shimmered with heat, iron, nickel, sulfur, carbon, a slurry of the primordial thrust upward from the mantle. in pulses, the slow heartbeat of a planet still dreaming. And around these vents, where temperatures broke the edge of boiling and pressure crushed all softness, life might have begun. Not in comfort, but in boundary, because silence is not the absence of noise, it is the condition for listening. And here, in the places light had never touched, the first molecules may have listened to gradients, to flows, to differences in temperature, in pH, in concentration. These were not choices. They were invitations. Each contrast, a line in an unwritten grammar. Each mineral surface, a page on which reactions could unfold. The water was not still. It roared in currents around the vents, pulling heat into cold and cold into heat. This constant reaching across gradients, this motion between what is and what is not, is the first act of desire. Not love, but longing. A longing written in ions. A yearning held in hydrogen. Protons surge through alkaline waters, like whispers through stone. The walls of vent chimneys, laced with iron-sulfur compounds, offered structure, offered anchoring points. For molecules too fragile to last alone, they clung, and, in clinging, they changed. The first reactions were not explosive. They were patient, tiny steps in a spiral. Energy captured not in fire, but in flow. Somewhere within this maze of mineral veins, the first metabolic loops may have begun. Reactions that fed into themselves, closed circuits of chemical persistence. This was not life, but it was survival. And survival, even before cells, before genes, before division, is already sacred. Because what survives, builds. And what builds, remembers. Even without thought, even without time. The vent walls became scaffolds for structure to rise. Not architecture, but rhythm. Not replication, but persistence. Small carbon chains, acetate, pyruvate, preludes to cycles that would one day carry energy through every cell. They did not know what they were doing, but they did it anyway. The silence held them. The darkness did not question. The pressure did not flinch. And in that constancy, life found a kind of shelter, more profound than light. It found a place to try, to fail, to try again, to bind, to bend, to replicate poorly, then slightly better. And every improvement was a trace, scratched into the walls of time. These were not cells, not yet, but maybe precursors to them, tiny compartments, formed by the flow of charged particles across mineral boundaries, natural batteries, microscopic sanctuaries, places where inside and outside could begin to mean something, where a molecule might be held just long enough to become more than itself. This is how silence creates, not by giving answers, but by allowing space for questions to unfold. And the questions did unfold, in spirals, in loops, in the fragile attempt of matter to continue. The earth, in its deepest stillness, was becoming a cradle, not of flesh, not of thought, but of pattern. And pattern, once it begins, does not end. It only deepens, rearranges, learns. In this place without sun, life may have first leaned forward, unseen, unnamed, unending. There are places so dark, even memory cannot reach them. Yet, the molecules remember. They do not speak. They do not think. But they endure. And endurance becomes a kind of voice, a kind of echo, folded into form. Beneath the weight of water, beneath the folds of crust, that rose and fell like sleeping breath, the first cycles whispered themselves into being. The silence here was not empty. It was full, dense with minerals, with gradients, with unfinished sentences, written in carbon. The walls of vent chimneys breathed out iron and sulfur. These were not poisons, they were pages, and on those pages, chemistry traced the earliest loops of persistence. The reverse citric acid cycle, a name the molecules never knew, yet one they seemed to remember anyway. Carbon fixing itself into rings, hydrogen sliding into cracks, electrons dancing between minerals, as if they already knew the steps. There was no DNA, Not yet. No helix of inheritance. But information had begun to flow, not in symbols, in structures, in molecules that changed shape depending on what they touched, in reactions that repeated not because they were told, but because they worked. Work, in this world, was survival, to bind and not break, to gather energy without collapse, to last one moment longer than entropy expected. And entropy watched, as it always does. But the molecules had learned to slip between its fingers, not forever, just long enough to replicate, enough to grow. The ocean floor became a field of small experiments, bubbles that rose, then vanished, chains that formed, then shattered, membranes that held, then dissolved. But some didn't. Some held, some persisted, some reached across the mineral scaffold and found what they didn't know they were missing. This wasn't life. It was rehearsal, but even rehearsals leave traces. And so the rocks began to change, traces of carbon trapped in ancient pillow lavas, signatures left not by breath, but by chemistry just shy of consciousness. These early systems, they weren't alive. Not yet. But they weren't inanimate either. They hovered in the in-between, too fragile for fossils, too scattered for bones, but not gone, never gone. Because pattern is a survivor. It lingers long after form collapses. It weaves itself into new hosts, new scaffolds, new shelters. And in this deep, pressurized cathedral, pattern had found sanctuary. Even the water knew. It carried ions like lullabies, buffered temperatures, like lullabies, bore the weight of early complexity, like lullabies. And the earth, for all its violence, did not interrupt. It let the silence speak. Every vent was a breath. Every breath, a new arrangement. Each mineral-laced exhalation, a soft question. Can you stay? Can you hold? Can you remember? And some molecules answered. They folded into loops that resisted unraveling. They nested within membranes that accidentally closed around them. They stumbled into cycles that fed themselves. There was no awareness, only sequence. And sequence, even blind, becomes ritual. The ritual of replication, the ritual of reaction, the ritual of trying again, and again, and again. What began in the dark did not need light to continue. It had found something better, more constant, more ancient. It had found silence. And in that silence, the molecules did not need a spark. They only needed time. There is a kind of intelligence that lives in stillness, not in thought, not in mind, but in the quiet arrangement of matter that refuses to fall apart, and in the deep vents, in the mineral cathedrals of heat and shadow. This intelligence began to form, not to think, but to persist, to respond, to organize, before cells, before genes, before time knew how to mark its own passage. There were protocells, bubbles, not round and clean, but ragged, shifting, soft-edged skins of lipids and longing, formed at the interface between mineral and molecule, between inside and out, between pressure and possibility. They did not live, but they separated space. They held in what could react and held out what would dissolve. And that was enough. Enough to start. Enough to continue. Because containment is the first act of identity. Without borders, there is only soup. But with a wall, however thin, however temporary, a story can begin. The first membranes may have formed where fatty acids danced on the surface of warm pools, or where heat from the vents coaxed lipids into layers that folded in on themselves. Some burst, some broke, some endured, and inside those that endured, the world changed. Not fast, not loud, but deeply. Molecules, now trapped together, had nowhere to drift. They collided, they reacted, they built, by accident, by proximity, by inevitability. Some chains grew long enough to fold back on themselves, not just because they could, but because it made them stronger, more stable, more likely to survive. The next wave, the next shock, the next silence, folding, holding, repeating. A molecule that folds becomes more than shape. It becomes memory, because it remembers where to bend, how to fit, how to hold itself together. And some of these folded strands, some loops of early RNA or its mimicry, began to echo what would one day be called life. They could bind, they could catalyze, they could copy imperfectly. But even imperfection, given time, becomes evolution. And evolution is not noise, it is not clamour, it is the long hush of matter learning itself. In these ancient containers, molecules began to act as systems, not as intention, but as choreography, as cycles, one reaction feeding the next, one molecule shaping the fate of another, a cascade of what worked, being repeated, until repetition became rule, and rule, in silence, became truth. No eye saw this, no being bore witness, but the earth remembered it anyway. In the layers of rock, in the isotopes buried deep, in the story, the sea still whispers to those who listen closely, because the vents still breathe, even now. The chimneys still rise from the ocean floor, still spew their black and white plumes, still cradle strange life that echoes a time before light, a time when chemistry was the only voice, and silence the only stage. We look down, now, into those depths and wonder how life began. But life does not begin. It gathers. It accretes. It waits. And in the waiting, the world builds the conditions to cradle it. The silence below was never empty. It was preparation, and what it prepared was the beginning of inheritance. The silence had become architecture, no longer emptiness, no longer waiting, but a lattice of reactions nested within membranes, fueled by gradients, pressed into motion by the weight of the deep. The vents did not speak, but they sustained. Their breath, rich with sulfur and heat, offered not warmth, but continuity. And continuity, over enough time, becomes meaning. In the hidden scaffolds of mineral walls, some molecules began to copy themselves, not flawlessly, but repeatedly. The first inheritance was not faithful. It was fragile, full of error, full of noise. But within that noise, the pattern strengthened. Error became variation. Variation became advantage. Advantage became memory. The earliest strands, whether RNA or something simpler, did not think, but they remembered. They folded in precise ways, not by design, but by habit. They carried their structure forward, held it in loops and coils that reached across generations of accident and persistence. This was not evolution as we know it. This was the prelude, the breath before the voice. Each molecule a syllable, each membrane a mouth that held nothing but hope. And yet they survived, long enough to divide, long enough to pass something on, a structure, a sequence, a whisper of order that refused to die. Order, once born, spreads, quietly, irrevocably. And beneath the crushing sea, beneath the silence, beneath the memories pressed into rock and time, order bloomed, not in flowers, in feedback loops, tiny systems that cycled energy, that took in and gave out, that built molecules and kept building. The beginnings of metabolism, not written, but etched, not planned, but proven, because what worked once had a chance to work again, and again, and again, and slowly those chances became legacy. Protocells, too simple to be called alive, became platforms for something deeper. The first true cells may have formed here, not all at once, not cleanly, but piece by piece, a membrane, a metabolic core, a strand of copying code that remembered enough to rebuild itself. They formed, they split, they carried forward. They were no longer just chemistry, they were continuity. And continuity, when it can preserve itself across time, is the first breath, not of air, but of identity, not lungs, not motion, but self, something within a boundary that insists, however softly, I will remain. And earth, still dark, still restless, still wrapped in sky without colour, had done the impossible. It had birthed a loop that could hold itself, a flicker that would not go out. The silence had not been broken. It had deepened, because what rose in that silence was not a voice. It was a pulse, a rhythm, a persistence that would one day become the forest, the fin, the feather, the child. But now it was just the cell, alone but not without kin, simple but not without purpose. And that purpose was to keep going, to carry the thread, to remember what the rocks had taught, what the heat had carved, what the ocean had nurtured, and what the silence had shaped. The vents still whisper, they still breathe, they still hold creatures that echo this ancient dawn. Their metabolisms strange, their genomes primitive, their lives bound to heat and sulphur, like prayers to a forgotten god. And though the sky above would one day turn blue, though continents would one day drift, though minds would one day ask how this all began, the answer would remain in the dark, in silence, in shape, in the memory of molecules that did not forget. And now the earth turns, not away from silence, but into another kind, toward the stone that learned to replicate, a new chapter of memory etched not in shadows, but in form. Before there were cells, before genes held code, before carbon knew how to whisper in spirals, there was stone, not the stone of mountains, not yet, but the stone of surfaces, of sheets, of crystalline stillness, waiting for something to cling. This was not biology, but it was more than geology, because some stones do not merely sit, they offer, and in the Hadean and Archean world, certain minerals held out their hands, mica, clays, silicates layered like pages in a book not yet written, their surfaces charged, their textures fine, their layers capable of catching what would otherwise drift. And drifting, molecules were, RNA-like strands, fatty acids, tiny loops of carbon logic, too soft to stand alone. But when they met stone, they paused, they anchored, because stone, though still, was not passive. Its structure shaped the molecules that touched it, held them close enough to interact, spaced them just right, for bonding, for folding, for memory to begin. Not thought, not life, but repetition, and repetition is the seed from which memory grows. These mineral sheets, layered by the hands of volcanoes and time, became the first scaffolds, not to build, but to support, because life did not emerge from the void, it emerged from the margins, from the meeting of soft molecule and hard stone, from the contrast between the fluid and the fixed, from the way certain minerals didn't just host reactions, they encouraged them. Montmorillonite clay, with its layered structure, helped link nucleotides into longer chains. Chains that, left alone, might have broken, but here, on stone, they stayed, long enough to fold, long enough to copy, long enough to begin again. This was not instruction, it was invitation. The stones did not know, but they gave anyway. And what they gave was persistence, a place to hold together what water would otherwise wash away, a surface where molecules could meet, react, divide, and return. The planet's crust, still reshaping, still thin in places, had begun to lift islands of this catalytic stone into shallow basins, and in those basins, waves lapped softly at sheets of layered clay. Each wave brought new molecules. Each retreat left some behind. Like fingerprints on ancient paper, these residues began to map the choreography of early replication. The stone had no language, but it learned to repeat. And, in repetition, there is rhythm, and rhythm, given silence, becomes voice. Not a loud voice, not a sudden one, but a slow mineral murmur that taught carbon how to stay, not forever, just long enough, because that's all life ever needed, a moment to hold itself in place, long enough to try folding, to try copying, to try remembering what had worked before the last tide came. And the stone remembered everything, not in words, but in structure, in layers that caught the faintest chains of possibility and offered them time. There is a tenderness in the way certain minerals hold, not grip, hold, with patience, with neutrality, with the quietest kind of permission. And so the first codes, born not in DNA, but in fragments, found their sanctuary. Stone did not create life. It allowed it. And allowance, in a world still eroding, was everything. The earth was still new, still changing, its skin thin, its bones hot. But in the shallows, on the edge of craters filled with warmth and windless water, stone had begun to hold a kind of rhythm. Each ripple of the tide swept across mineral surfaces, like a hand across parchment, leaving behind the fragments that would one day mean life. It was not design. It was permission. Permission to stay, to linger, to try. And the clays, layered like forgotten pages, offered a structure where chance could repeat itself. Minerals did not move, but they influenced. Their charge attracted certain ions. Their layers spaced molecules just wide enough for new bonds to form. Not many, not often, but enough. Because enough, in the quiet arithmetic of emergence, is everything. In these warm, shallow places, drying and wetting in slow rhythm, something remarkable began. Polymers, chains of building blocks, nucleotides, amino acids, early lipids, stretching and curling along surfaces that held them like breath in cupped hands. When the water dried, they grew longer, stranded together in the absence of solvent, forced to link, forced to remember. When the water returned, some chains broke apart, others held on. And in that cycle of drying and flooding, loss and persistence, the first editing began. The world, through stone and time, was selecting, not perfectly, not with intent, but through rhythm. The molecules that broke were scattered. The ones that endured were copied, over days, over centuries, over spans of time. No cell would ever understand. This was the first replication, not in the way cells do it now, not inside, but on the surface, an exposed kind of memory, vulnerable, open to the wind, to light, to the crush of mineral pressure. But it happened. A strand curled just right and attracted its match, base to base, shape to shape, a ghost of the double helix, a murmur before the spiral. And from that pairing, new chains could form, each one a little different, each one a little longer, each one a little more able to remain. And what remained began to influence its own making. Some strands folded into shapes that catalyzed the assembly of others, early ribozymes, molecules that helped their kin build more of themselves, not alive, but leaning toward it, not self-aware, but self-encouraging. The stone watched it all, silently, patiently. It held no opinions, only structure, only stillness, only the gift of surface. And surface was enough, because life did not begin in chaos. It began in contact. The closeness of molecule to molecule, the gentleness of repetition, the pressure of pattern against erosion. And what resisted erosion became the foundation. The first rules were not written in the sky. They were etched into clay. Rules of folding, rules of sticking, rules of keeping close what might otherwise fall away. The earth did not notice. There were no witnesses, no minds to record. Only the wind, only the sea, only the stone, learning by repetition. And in the pause between each tide, life inched forward, on a surface that did not speak, but remembered everything. What is memory, if not the ability to remain, to persist when all else forgets, to hold form in a world of dissolving shapes? The stone had no mind, but it remembered. In its layered clays, its fractured surfaces, its negative charges clinging to the faintest strands of carbon, it cradled the possibility of memory, not as thought, but as architecture, because even before consciousness, the earth was building something that could recognize itself. When early polymers curled on mineral shelves, the surface became mirror, and mirror became invitation. Some strands folded in ways that made them stable, others fell apart. The stable ones clung longer, and in their lingering, they invited replication. Stone became the first editor, not cutting, not composing, but favouring, permitting, allowing the strands that could remain to linger one more tide, to survive one more drying, and what remains becomes precedent. As strands grew longer, they did not float away. They nested in crevices, sheltered by fine grains of clay, bathed in mineral-rich waters that flowed across the skin of the earth, like thoughtless fingers across parchment. In these soft corners, folding turned into function. Some loops could catalyze, some could bind, some became templates for others to echo. The difference between accident and purpose was still infinite, but narrowing. The sun still burned above, veiled by methane and cloud. Its rays barely pierced the sky, but sometimes they touched the stone. And when light reached those exposed pools, those drying films of clay and code, it sparked new bonds. Photochemistry, heat without fire, energy without violence. It didn't create life. It nudged it forward. One molecule at a time, the boundary between structure and strategy blurred, and so began a strange and sacred partnership. Stone and strand, mineral and memory, the inorganic lending order to the organic, the rigid offering shape to the soft. Eventually, some strands grew bold. They left their surfaces, torn loose by waves, or lifted by winds, or caught in droplets, rising from evaporating pools. Some dissolved, some failed, but some drifted into new places. New stones, new patterns. The world had become a network of possibility. Each surface, each puddle, each fragment of mica or clay, a page in a book without an author. But the book was being written anyway, and its language was chemistry. Its alphabet carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, spoken in loops, folds, repeats. This was replication, not perfected, but rehearsed. And with each rehearsal, the molecules came closer to something living. Stone is not soft, but it has always known how to hold, and holding, in a universe of forgetting, is the first gesture of care. No intention, no creator, no grand orchestration, just time, just patience, just a planet, learning how to become the memory it would one day carry. In a world without eyes, without lungs, without thought, memory still found a way, and it began with stone, not etched in tools or carved in monuments, but layered quietly in the microstructure of minerals that held the first loops of longing, a longing not for meaning, but for continuity. The tide came again, the water kissed the clay, the heat dried the pool, the strands collapsed, then recombined, day after day, century after century, each cycle pressing down, not to destroy, but to refine, each loop of replication a test, each fragment that survived a message. This worked, try again. And the earth tried again, through chemistry, through erosion, through every small collapse that left behind something slightly more complete. Somewhere, a strand folded inward in a way that allowed it not only to copy itself, but to help another strand do the same. Catalysis, not from metal, not from stone, but from the strand itself, a molecule helping another molecule build its own reflection. This was not life. Not yet, but it was closer than silence had ever been. The clays, the silicates, they did not resist. They cradled these fragile beginnings with the impartial grace only the inorganic can give, never asking, never judging, only allowing and allowance. In a universe of chance is a kind of sacredness, because what is sacred but the space given to become what cannot yet be named? Over time, these structures became less dependent on surface, less anchored to stone. They began to float, to carry their own boundaries, to contain their own reactions. Protocells, not quite alive, but no longer stone-bound. Within them, fragments of code drifted, looped, interacted. Some broke apart, but the ones that endured carried something new, not just molecules, but instructions, tiny whispers of form, tiny echoes of sequence. These early codes did not speak with clarity, but they remembered enough to be copied, and with each copy, errors crept in. But sometimes, those errors made something new, and so mutation became momentum, variation became movement, and from the surface of clay, life began to rise, not with wings, not with voice, but with tenacity, a persistence stronger than chaos. We do not remember the first strand. It left no fossil. It had no name. It did not know it was important, but it endured. And from that endurance, everything followed. Every coral, every crow, every child. It began with stone, but it did not stay there. The earth had offered a mirror, and the mirror had learned to reflect itself. The mineral world, so still, so silent, had opened a path for memory to walk forward. And now, life walked with it, folded into cells, curled in spirals, encoded in every breath, every leaf, every heartbeat that would one day echo the rhythm of those earliest tides. The stone never spoke, but it taught, and what it taught was enough to carry the thread, from clay to cell, from silence to voice, from surface to self. Now the earth draws a breath, not from stone, but from carbon, its oldest student. Carbon that danced on clay, that whispered in spirals, that learned to bond and never let go. Carbon, at last, says yes. Carbon had always been here, waiting, lingering in stardust, in ancient clouds of hydrogen and helium, in the bones of planets yet to breathe. It had no voice, but it listened, for time, for silence, for invitation. And one day, in the warmth between stone and tide, in the hush after the lightning, carbon said yes, not with sound, but with bond. It linked once, then again, then again. 4 arms, 4 directions, 4 chances to hold what others could not. This was not randomness. This was affinity, a flexibility so profound it became destiny. Carbon could reach in all directions, and it did, to hydrogen, to oxygen, to nitrogen, to itself. Chains formed, rings spiraled, webs grew dense and intricate, without ever becoming rigid. This was the beginning of the language life would one day speak. But it did not begin in words. It began in the shape of bonds, tetrahedral, gentle, impossibly strong, yet endlessly reconfigurable. Carbon did not choose. It allowed, and allowance became everything. Somewhere in the thick oceans of the Archean Earth, carbon gathered itself into loops, aromatic rings, backbones for molecules that could fold, stack, align. It reached for nitrogen, and they formed bases: adenine, guanine, cytosine, uracil, fragments of future code. It reached for sugars, and ribose curled softly into its palm. It reached for phosphates, and together they formed chains. One base, one sugar, one phosphate at a time. A nucleotide, then another, then a strand. Carbon had not invented life, but it had found the shape life needed to become. The strand drifted, floated in warm pools, settled on mica shelves, clung to vent walls. It twisted, it folded. Sometimes it broke, sometimes it held. And when it held, it invited its mirror, a strand made to match, base for base, a whisper against the first. And in this pairing, carbon said yes again. Yes to memory. Yes to symmetry. Yes to the possibility of replication. Elsewhere, carbon was saying yes in other ways. It joined with hydrogen, forming the fatty acids that slipped into circles. Micelles, vesicles, membranes, not yet alive, but already protective. It joined with sulfur, with iron, with oxygen, with phosphorus, each bond a vote for persistence. Carbon never ruled, but it guided, it made space for everything else to join. It was the hand that reached out and never closed. Life would one day be built on proteins, on nucleic acids, on sugars and fats, but all of them rested on carbon's spine, a spine that bent but did not break, a scaffold soft enough for growth, strong enough for memory. Carbon was not alive, but it made life possible, not through power, through participation, through the willingness to say yes to every element that needed a dance. And in this dance, pattern emerged, folding, stacking, cycling, repeating. Soon, carbon chains became enzymes. Enzymes became reactions. Reactions became metabolism. And metabolism, that endless looping breath, became the drumbeat beneath all future life. There is a reason. Carbon never left. Why even now, in every cell, in every strand of DNA, in every memory and breath and seed, carbon holds the center. It said yes. Before anything else knew how to speak, it opened its arms and the universe moved in. Not all yeses are loud. Some bloom slowly, like warmth rising from stone, long after the fire has passed. Carbon's yes was like that. Quiet, layered, expansive. It did not announce itself. It deepened. In every fold of every chain, in every loop of prebiotic chemistry, in every molecule that dared to hold itself together, carbon was there, soft as ash, patient as erosion. It linked molecules into order, not because it was forced, but because it could. And in the beginning, that was everything. Even now, life's every function leans on this quiet architecture. The hexagon rings, the branching chains, the spirals that coil into spirals. Carbon doesn't impose symmetry, it invites it. Its forearms reach like memory, holding what needs to be held, letting go when the pattern demands it. And what it held then, what it still holds now, is the shape of continuity. Because life is not made of one molecule, it is made of relationships, carbon and hydrogen, carbon and oxygen, carbon and nitrogen. These bonds are not rules, they are agreements, old ones, ancient ones, born in the dark, kept in warmth, passed on, not through language, but through folding. Carbon is promiscuous. It binds freely, yet holds faithfully. It can be flexible and strong, rigid and soft, linear and coiled, all at once. No other element can do what it does. No other element wanted to. And so, carbon stood at the center of every attempt at persistence, every whisper of a cell, every fragment of a code. The carbon backbone became the path along which life first walked. But carbon's yes was not just chemical, it was philosophical, a statement of openness, to change, to error, to the kind of instability that breeds complexity. Where others broke apart, carbon adapted. Where others dissolved, it shaped itself into something new. Each failed molecule was not an end. It was a question. And carbon, again and again, answered with another yes. A new loop, a new chain, a new scaffold for evolution to build upon. RNA was not inevitable, but it was invited. The sugar-phosphate backbone, curled with nitrogenous bases, held together by carbon's quiet bonds, was the first molecule to remember how to remember. It did not think, but it carried form, and form is the beginning of thought. In time, some RNA strands began to act on their own. They catalyzed reactions. They encouraged their own copying. They were no longer passive. They were participants. The world had moved from chemistry to choreography, from structure to performance. And carbon was still there, weaving every gesture into continuity. In other pools, fatty acids, stitched with carbon, closed into circles, vesicles, protocells, membranes that did not simply contain, they sheltered, they preserved. And inside those quiet shells, strands curled, reactions looped, gradients formed. Carbon said yes to boundaries, to insides and outsides, to the separation that made selfhood possible. Not identity, but the possibility of identity. And what is life, if not the long echo of that first division? It did not happen once. It happened again, and again, and again. Each molecule that held its shape, each loop that could copy, Each membrane that did not burst was a chapter, and carbon was the spine, the thread that held the story together, even when the story didn't yet know it was a story. We call it the carbon cycle now, a grand pattern of atmosphere, ocean, rock, and life, interchanging forms. But before the cycle had a name, it was a promise. Carbon would not leave. It would turn. It would travel. It would dissolve and rise and sink and settle. But it would always return, not as what it was, but as what it could be. That is what carbon said yes to. Not permanence, but return. Not perfection, but persistence. And in that promise, every living thing took root. Carbon did not build alone, but it was always at the center, like a quiet architect who speaks only through invitation. Never command, never certainty, only the gentle gravity of possibility. And in the early seas, possibility was everything. The world was warm, but not soft. The oceans were thick with metals, the sky still veiled in haze. Oxygen had not yet arrived to carve away the past. But carbon did not wait. It moved through water in forms that would become the breath of cells. Simple molecules, formate, acetate, pyruvate, the syllables of future metabolism. They gathered near vents, along the mineral corridors, in tide pools thick with prebiotic memory, and they cycled over and over. Each loop not perfect, but close. Carbon didn't create energy. It learned how to trap it, how to hold just enough to make a difference. There were cycles now, tiny ones, fragile, partial, held together by the soft insistence that things did not have to fall apart. The beginnings of the carbon fixation cycles we would one day name. Calvin, Krebs, reverse TCA, were already whispering in vent walls and clay shelves. Carbon drifted into these pathways, not as a ruler, but as a thread, weaving through reactions, connecting one to the next, giving structure to energy, direction to change. Elsewhere, carbon spiraled into sugars. Formaldehyde joined with itself, over and over, until a chain of sweetness formed. Ribose, a sugar that bent just right, that curled perfectly around nitrogenous bases. It held them. It carried them. It didn't break. RNA was not just possible. It was welcomed, because carbon had already shaped the spaces into which it could fit. And once those chains formed, bases, sugar, phosphate, they curled into spirals, single-stranded at first, then double whenever a complementary strand appeared. Life had not begun, but the illusion of intention had, molecules seeking their mirror, strands finding strands, reactions folding into patterns that began to self-reinforce. And carbon, never leading, never resisting, was always in the middle. 4 bonds, always 4, stable but never rigid, strong but never closed. Carbon chains became peptides. Peptides became proteins. Some curled into shapes that helped reactions move faster. Enzymes in their earliest forms. Catalysts made of folded chains, born from carbon's flexibility, carbon's readiness to say yes to complexity. These were no longer just molecules. They were tools, and tools, even the simplest, changed the world around them. There was no cell yet, no nucleus, no DNA, no language, but the code had begun, not written in letters, written in structure, in charge, in polarity, in the soft electrochemical suggestions that coaxed molecules to join hands. Carbon didn't speak, but it translated between energy and matter, between inside and outside, between what was and what could become. Inside the protocells, those lipid spheres floating in tide pools or near hydrothermal vents, carbon drifted freely, bound into loops, chained into enzymes, coiled in strands that sometimes copied themselves with more precision than chance should allow. In the hush of pressure, inside the stillness of containment, the molecular symphony found its first conductor. Not a being, not a will, just the perfect combination of shape, charge and bond. Carbon, always in the middle, always allowing. Outside the membranes, the world churned. Rain fell, heat pulsed, stone cracked. But inside, there was quiet. Not peace, but order, temporary, flickering, but enough. Enough to be copied, enough to return, enough to become the first glimpse of life's shadow. Carbon did not create order. It made it possible. And when the world asked, over and over, can this remain? Can this last? Can this hold together one moment longer? Carbon's answer was always, yes. Not because it had to, but because it could. And that yes echoes still, in every leaf, in every flame, in every breath you take, and every word ever spoken by a mind that rose from molecules, curled around. Carbon's silent promise. What does it mean to endure? Not through strength, but through permission, through patience, through the quiet gift of being able to connect. Again and again and again, carbon endured, not by resisting change, but by making room for it. It did not conquer the early world. It became the world's memory. In those first protocells, carbon cradled the smallest stories, a folded protein that catalyzed a reaction, a strand of RNA that matched its own mirror, a vesicle that divided once and survived. There were no instructions, no blueprints, no voices, only the rhythm of repetition, of mistakes that persisted, just long enough to become patterns. And in those patterns, carbon said yes once more. That yes moved slowly, through cycles of nightless time, through oceans that never knew colour, through skies still heavy with methane and silence. Carbon flowed between forms. It was never still. In vent fields, it bound with sulphur. In shallow ponds, it formed sugars. On mineral shelves, it copied itself into code. And each transformation left behind a fingerprint, a ghost of energy exchanged, a whisper of what came next. As protocells became more stable, carbon was always inside them, shaping their metabolism, carrying their inheritance. It formed the basis of lipids that held the membrane, of amino acids that folded into enzymes, of nucleotides that carried memory in spirals. And still, it never claimed control. It never stopped offering. It moved in cycles. It gave itself freely. And this movement, this return, became life's most ancient law. The first metabolic loops were not efficient. They lost energy. They faltered. But they repeated. And the world does not reward perfection. It rewards repetition. Repetition sharpens, refines, carves function out of chance, and carbon, with its perfect arms and unshakable bonds, became the spine of every function. Even now, it curls through everything living. What began as chemistry had become continuity. What was once a molecule had become a messenger. Carbon carried the story without knowing what story was. And when, at last, the protocells no longer broke apart, when they began to divide, to hold, to remember, it was carbon who had built the bridge, not alone, but at the center, always reaching, always saying yes. This was the moment when life stepped across the threshold. No ceremony, no flash, only a quiet crossing from replication into selfhood. Not yet awareness, but identity, a system that could copy itself and carry what worked into the next moment, and the next, and the next. Carbon had made this possible, not by seeking life, but by refusing to resist complexity. It did not ask what it was building. It simply connected, and in that connection, the world found its answer. Even now, in every cell, every breath, every pulse of heart or chloroplast, carbon's yes continues. Every protein coiled into shape, every strand of DNA spun into memory, every neuron flickering with thought, all of it, anchored to that original agreement. I will hold, I will return, I will change, but I will not vanish. Carbon will burn, it will bury, it will drift through air or sink into stone, but it does not forget, because to be made of carbon is to belong to the same whisper that passed through vents and pools and silence. It is to inherit 1 billion years of folding, of forming, of surviving, without knowing why, only knowing how. And so the first carbon breathes still, not in lungs, but in loops, not in fire, but in the memory of what can bind and never come undone. And what carbon began, life did not stop. There was a time when nothing yet breathed, but something had already begun to hold its breath. Not lungs, not motion, not the swell and fall of air, but the shape of breath, the pause before a storm, the stillness before a tide turns. It lived in bubbles, in membranes made of lipids, fragile shells floating in ancient seas, closing around silence, as if silence itself needed protecting. These were not cells, not quite, but they were becoming. And in that becoming, something extraordinary unfolded. The protocell, a whisper wrapped in water and oil, drifting on currents that had never known direction, was the first structure to hold inside and outside as two different truths. A line had been drawn, not by decision, but by structure. Inside, a chemistry held just long enough to do something more than dissolve. Outside, the wild, hot sea, still hungry, still full of noise. And between them, a boundary, not strong, not final, but enough to cradle, enough to begin. This is the first breath, not of oxygen, but of definition, because breath is not merely air, it is separation, it is exchange, something going in, something coming out. And for that to happen, there must be a vessel, a space, a skin, and the protocell became the vessel, carbon curled within. So did nitrogen, so did memory, not whole yet, not organized, but gathered. Metabolic loops began inside these shells, tiny cycles of energy, transferring electrons from one molecule to the next, holding just enough tension to keep the pattern spinning. They did not last forever, but they lasted long enough to divide, to share, to return. Some membranes grew unstable and burst. Some formed too thick and trapped what they needed. But some balanced just right. Not because they were smarter, but because they were shaped by time. Lipid bilayers, what we now see in every living cell, were born not through brilliance, but through erosion. The erosion of what did not work, the quiet sanding down of everything that failed, until only the almosts remained. And almost, as the Earth already knew, was enough to gather complexity, enough to hold chemistry. Like lungs hold breath. Inside, the reactions deepened, energy flowed, molecules danced. RNA strands copied, folded, mutated. New peptides formed. Some helped shape the membrane. Some helped reactions happen faster. And when a protocell grew too large, the sea split it in two. Division, but not death. Each daughter inherited a bit of the parent. Each one carried forward a fraction of the past. And inheritance, even fragmented, is the beginning of lineage, of story, of self. This was not awareness, but it was the first boundary that allowed awareness to come later, the first space where matter and meaning could begin to entwine. And though no one was watching, life was practicing. The oceans no longer stirred with only elements. Now they held intention, still blind, still slow, still tangled in the physics of pressure and chance. But intention had arrived, not as thought, but as function, a protocell that could grow, that could divide, that could hold its own reactions within a boundary that did not always burst. This was the breath before breath, the inhale before lungs, the pause before the long exhalation called evolution. And all around, the earth waited, patient, heavy with sky, quiet beneath stars that still could not be seen. There was no blue, no green, no blood, no bone. But something lived, not loudly, not with will, but with structure that persisted. And persistence is where breath begins. The first breath was not taken, it was held. A moment inside a membrane, a hush inside a bubble, of fat and water cradling warmth. From a vent's slow exhale, it did not expand or contract. It did not pull in oxygen. There was no air, no sky, but there was difference. There was inside, and there was out, and between them, exchange. The earliest protocells lived at the mercy of chemistry. They were not born. They formed, accidentally, repeatedly. And each time they formed, the universe asked one question: can you last? Most did not, but a few answered by simply staying. Not forever, just long enough for the next tide. Long enough to copy a strand, to fold a protein, to divide and begin again. These were not organisms, not yet, but they were more than what had come before. They were systems, not closed, not stable, but continuous. And within them, the old cycles. Carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus now moved in circles, small enough to remember. They took in building blocks, amino acids, sugars, nucleotides. They stitched them together inside a skin that did not plan, but protected. Protection was enough. It gave the chemistry time to repeat, time to refine, time to forget that it had ever been random. And when these protocells touched minerals, when they floated across clay or brushed against iron-sulfur walls, something new happened. They changed, reacted, picked up new pieces, lost others. The world was sculpting them without tools. Only pressure, only time, only repetition, the quiet persistence of conditions. Sometimes a strand inside would fold into a shape that could coax two other strands to join. A ribozyme, a helper, not a will, not a brain, but the beginning of function that served something beyond itself. It wasn't survival, not yet, but it was survival's reflection, a foreshadowing, a breath caught in the chest of something not alive, yet not quite lifeless. Membranes became more complex. They learned to let certain things pass, ions, nutrients, signals, though no one yet knew what a signal was. Channels formed, tiny passageways, not built, but allowed, because the molecules that made them were sticky and curved and found each other again and again, until their presence was no longer chance. What had once been chaos was now choreography. The dance of molecules became familiar, predictable, repetitive in the most sacred way, because repetition is where breath becomes rhythm, where chaos learns to hum. Some protocells vanished, some burst, some merged, but some, a few, lasted longer. They left no fossils, no bones, but they left lineage, a trail of form, preserved in what came next. And what came next was not more complex, just more capable of staying. We call it emergence, but it was not sudden. It was the soft layering of maybes over millions of years, the rise of a self that did not yet know it was separate, a system that could repeat itself with enough fidelity to leave a trace, a loop inside a boundary, capable of holding its own tomorrow. That was the first breath, not drawn in, but circled, a whisper of energy, held long enough to carry forward. What worked? No lungs, no wind, but the memory of movement, of containment, of something crossing a line and not coming undone. The earth didn't celebrate, it didn't notice. It continued to turn beneath a sky still choked in haze. The vents still breathed, the rain still fell, the stones still waited. But now something breathed with them, something that had learned to carry its own silence. And in that silence, life did not begin. It continued. Not all breaths are taken in. Some are held, some are passed. Some are shared across boundaries that did not yet know they were skin. The protocell held its breath, not by drawing in air, but by holding within itself the memory of movement, of chemistry folded into rhythm, of difference sustained just long enough to try again. It did not know what it was doing, but it kept doing it. And what it kept was not perfection. It was pattern. Each boundary, each fragile wall of lipids and longing, marked the world's first distinction between what belongs and what does not, between the inside and the sea. Inside, a set of molecules, learning to stay together. Outside, the chaos they came from, and in between, the membrane, a whisper-thin division with the weight of eternity. Protocells began to change, not through decision, but through persistence. They grew more porous, more selective. They began to host reactions they could not explain, and in their quiet interiors, something new began to stir. Gradients, not visible, not grand, but essential. The uneven distribution of ions, of energy, of potential. A proton here, a missing one there, a tension too small to see, but large enough to set reactions in motion. This, too, was breath, not in and out, but across, a breath that passed from one side of a membrane to the other, a current of charged possibility. The early world was shaped by such tiny differences. They formed the first engines, not engines of metal, but of flow, of chemical push and pull. Some protocells learned to harness these flows, to use them to drive the copying of strands, the folding of proteins, the movement of parts, within their narrow boundaries. And with each cycle, the system became more coherent, more stable, more whole. Still, there was no awareness, but there was continuity. The inside began to matter. The membrane was no longer just a wall. It was an archive. It held, it carried, it became the frame upon which identity could begin to emerge. And with identity, however faint, came persistence. These protocells no longer depended entirely on luck. They carried with them what had worked before. They refined it, not with intention, but with inheritance. And inheritance is a kind of memory, not of moments, but of function. There were protocells that divided cleanly, their membranes parting, like silk in warm water, each half carrying forward a trace of the original, the spiral of RNA, the loops of metabolism, the rhythm of a breath, not yet drawn, but never forgotten. Eventually, some protocells gained the power to make more of themselves from the pieces around them. They could grow, not forever, not perfectly, but enough. And growth, in a universe of decay, is defiance. It is the insistence on shape, on return, on one more moment. We imagine life as something that began, but it didn't begin. It happened, slowly, softly, repeatedly, until repetition became structure, and structure became story, and story found a way to stay. This is what the first breath was. Not a gasp, not a spark, not a miracle. It was a pause, a gathering, a stillness held just long enough for everything fragile to become something that could last. Even now, cells carry that breath. Every membrane, every folded protein, every loop of DNA remembers the hush that came before voice, remembers the thin boundary between dissolution and return. We breathe now, with lungs, with purpose, but life began in a breath that wasn't taken, a breath that held the possibility of all the others to come. And that breath, so small, so ancient, so silent, never left. It only deepened. Would you like me to continue with the final part of the breath before the first breath? The breath before the first breath. Part 4 of to 4, approx 800 plus words. Breath is not always movement. Sometimes it is containment, the sheltering of change within the skin of stillness. The first protocells did not breathe as lungs do now. They did not inhale, they did not exhale, but they exchanged. And in that exchange, they discovered the secret. Life never stopped keeping. To remain, there must be difference, a gradient, a gentle pull from what is not toward what might be. Inside the thin walls of those first vesicles, life's scaffolding began to harden. Metabolic loops once fragile, dependent on minerals or the hand of tide, now unfolded within. The boundaries of a single form. Enzymes born from chance-folded chains of amino acids began to stabilize those loops. one small catalysis at a time. No mind, no direction, but a map was being drawn in the behavior of molecules that stayed. To stay, they needed food, not in the modern sense, not matter chewed or chosen, but energy. Gradients of ions, sources of carbon, the trickle of hydrogen, the whisper of sulfur. Each cell, no longer adrift in randomness, was becoming its own world, a pocket of chemistry, slightly less chaotic than the sea around it. And that slightness was the difference between breaking and becoming. At some forgotten threshold, a protocell did something. None before it had done. It repaired itself. A tear in the membrane, patched by molecules it made. A strand of code, reassembled from fragments. No audience watched. No history recorded the moment. But that act of restoring a self from within was the turning point. Not of life as an event, but of life as a commitment, a promise, etched in the loops of RNA, in the folds of early protein, that said, I will hold myself together. Replication became more than accident. It became cycle. And with cycle came inheritance. Imperfect, but persistent. Each copy bore the fingerprints of the one before. Each mistake, a possibility. Mutation, that soft hand of difference, began its patient work. Not carving, just nudging. The cells that learned to feed from their gradients, to copy their memory, to divide when full. They stayed. They became the lineages from which all others flowed. And all the while, their breath remained silent, invisible. A current of ions, moving across membranes. A charge balanced. A pattern kept. That is the oldest breath. The one no lungs remember, but every cell does. It is still there, in the mitochondria, in the chloroplast, in the way every heartbeat leans on energy, captured in a gradient, older than stars. This was no explosion, no dawn. It was dusk, that lingered too long, and learned how to survive the dark. The earth did not celebrate, it did not notice, but in its oceans, among the rocks and the vents, and the pools that dried and filled again, something lived, something that could carry itself forward, something that could learn. Without knowing, it was learning, and from that breath, the long story began. A story not of events, but of accumulation, of folding, of remembering through form instead of voice. Some truths are not passed in words. They are inherited through structure, through rhythm, through breath, and the first breath still echoes in them all. And so the earth exhaled, not with force, but with acceptance. It had learned how to hold the fragile engine of continuity. It had learned to cradle the silence that spoke in spirals. And now it turns again, toward the final chapter where all the whispers converge, where the planet that dreamed of nothing awakens to life. The earth never meant to create life. It did not plan. It did not hope. It simply became what the cosmos whispered into it, across fire and flood and silence. But in becoming, it dreamed, not with mind, not with meaning, but with motion. And the dream, slow, layered, patient, was life. From crust to cloud, ocean to orbit, the earth evolved not through invention, but through allowing. It allowed water to fall, then gather, allowed stone to cool, then crack, allowed carbon to wander, then bind, allowed molecules to fold, then replicate. Each allowance was a deep breath in the dark, and what it exhaled was complexity. The dream did not come all at once. It was not a single cell or a single spark. It was the rising tide of pattern that refused to leave, the soft insistence of memory forming within matter, the echo of possibility pressed into protocells, and from protocells into selves, and from selves into lineage. The earliest cells did not think, they did not feel, but they carried something sacred, the ability to return, to split, to copy, to transform, not randomly, but with rhythm, with direction, with just enough control. to remember. They learned to feed from gradients and light. Some breathed without oxygen. Some harvested energy from minerals in the seafloor. And some, a quiet few, began to shape the world around them. Cyanobacteria, little architects of air. They pulled carbon from the sea. They released oxygen into the sky. And the sky, so long forgotten, began to change. Not in colour, not yet, but in potential. Blue would come later, but breath had begun. This was the moment. The planet began to remember itself, not as rock or fire or silence, but as a host, a cradle, a vessel, not of life, but of its continuation. From vent to tide pool, from clay shelf to drifting droplet, the earth had gathered the materials, the conditions, the rhythms, and now it held them in place, not perfectly, not gently, but with deep geological patience. And patience, when stretched across eons, is indistinguishable from intention. We were not the plan. There was no plan. But we were the outcome of a dream so slow. It looked like erosion, a dream shaped by tides, carved by rain, held in minerals, whispered through carbon. A dream in which the earth did not see us, but still made space for us to be. The single cells became colonies. Some merged, some specialized, some carried the spark of internal time, and through them life grew in depth, not just in form, but in memory. The planet, still covered in haze, was stirring from within, not toward mind, not yet, but toward meaning, meaning born not from words, but from connection, from cycles, from inheritance. The earth had folded itself into living form, and now it turned slowly, its oceans filled with breathless song, its crust lined with unseen dreams. It did not know, but it remembered, and that was enough. The earth did not speak. It hummed, low and endless, a resonance held in the rock, in the ocean's swell, in the quiet exchange of minerals, beneath mountains not yet risen. Its voice was gravity. Its language was time, and time, repeated often enough, becomes memory. By now, the cells had learned to hold themselves, to remake themselves, to pass their patterns forward into daughters they would never meet. No thought guided them, only structure, only the quiet unfolding of reactions that worked just well enough to try again, and again, and again, until trying became nature, until success became quiet, until life, not sudden, not sharp, became the rhythm between tides. They drifted, they layered, they multiplied across unseen depths beneath a sky that still carried the breath of volcanoes. The surface world remained soft with heat, the air choked with haze, and yet the earth turned, and with each turn the cells endured. Photosynthesis began in silence, not as light filling lungs, but as energy drawn from brightness by cells that had never seen. Cyanobacteria took in sunlight, took in carbon, and let go of something no one had yet needed, oxygen, and the planet changed. Not at once, not loudly, but fundamentally. The oxygen lingered. At first, it vanished into stone, reacted with iron, turned oceans red. It rusted the world before it ever reached the sky. But the rust ran out, and the oxygen stayed. The sky began to shift, slowly, molecule by molecule, and light, for the first time, met blue. The earth was no longer just rock and heat and chemistry. It was beginning to shine, not in brightness, in process. The great cycles had begun. Carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, each loop feeding the next, each breath making space for what would come after. The planet was not aware, but it was participating. It had become an engine of continuity, a system capable of remembering itself through the persistence of form. And in the quiet places, cells began to cooperate. They did not know. They were becoming more. They only stayed when they stayed together. Symbiosis, not planned, not forced, but beneficial. And from that slow sharing, one cell folded into another. One gave energy. One offered protection. Mitochondria were born. Chloroplasts, inner worlds, inside the cell. And now, each cell carried with it a lineage of lineages, layered memory, nested inheritance. Life had grown deeper, not smarter, not stronger, but more entangled. And the earth, still turning, still silent, held it all. It offered no answers, only space, only conditions, only the slow, unstoppable erosion of what could not last. And in what remained, life found its continuity, from single cells to colonies, from drifting spheres to filaments that held, from stillness to motion. Flagella twitched, cilia waved. Some cells learned to glide. The first senses were not eyes, they were responses, a movement toward, a movement away. Direction, written not in thought, but in structure, and in direction, the faintest curve of desire. Desire not to survive, but to remain, to keep folding, to keep dividing, to keep breathing, even without breath. The earth had dreamed, not of beings, but of process, not of mind, but of memory, carried through matter. And now that memory, drifted in the ocean, coated the seafloor, turned the air faintly blue. The dream was alive, and the dream was not done. The earth was still young, but its dreams had grown old, not weary, just deep. Dreams, not of what might happen, but of what had already begun to repeat, because repetition is the only proof that something has taken root. By now, life no longer drifted. It reached. Cells clustered together. Some touched, some joined, some began to specialize, not from will, but from need. One part held memory, another absorbed the world, another moved. Division of labor became a kind of choreography. Each motion, each function, refining what had once been random. Multicellularity did not burst forth. It emerged slowly, in layers of trust, woven not with feeling, but with function. Some colonies held, others broke, but the ones that stayed, the ones that passed their shape forward, wrote new lines into the long sentence of life's becoming. The sea changed. What was once chemical soup became ecological fabric, not empty water, but a matrix of motion and metabolism, a web of cells breathing, excreting, communicating without sound. Tiny whispers of molecules passed from one cell to another, signals, responses, beginnings of dialogue. No language, but the promise of language. No thought, but the structure in which thought might one day fit. And the planet held this, softly, like the darkness that holds stars without knowing they shine. It offered nothing but time and silence and gravity, and the silence was never empty. It was layered with the weight of things not yet spoken. Above, the atmosphere thickened with oxygen. Slowly, irreversibly, what had once been poison became potential. Aerobic respiration, energy unlocked with oxygen, began. Cells grew stronger. Processes sped up, and time, so slow before, began to rush forward in the quiet way of acceleration. The dream, which had begun in stone, now burned in metabolism, each cell aflame, tiny, flickering, fed by sugar and gas. And still they did not know they were alive. They only knew how to continue. In the shallows, mats of life spread, layer upon layer, generation upon generation. Stromatolites, stone and cell, life and memory pressed into fossil, before death had even found its name. They are still here, still breathing, still singing, that ancient, wordless song. The earth watched, not with eyes, but with patience. Watched as shape gave way to function. Watched as function became form. Watched as form carried forward the delicate possibility of persistence. And then motion changed. Flagella became fins. Fins became purpose. Purpose turned to symmetry. And the symmetry was not for beauty, it was for balance. A mirror on either side of a single path, a forward. For the first time, there was a front, a direction. The dream had learned how to move. The ocean stirred differently now, not just with current, but with intention. Life no longer only reacted, it began to seek, not for meaning, not yet, but for light, for nutrients, for safety. And every motion forward was a memory, laid down in flesh. The earth was no longer just a place, it had become a story, one that told itself across molecules and membranes and migrations. A story not made of words, but of becoming, of returning, of the long, long unfolding of what it meant to endure. The planet still dreamed, but its dream had grown eyes, and gills, and the first threads of mind, not consciousness, not quite, but the memory of movement woven so deeply into tissue. That motion itself became meaning. Life did not know it was being watched, because there were no watchers, only the earth turning, listening, breathing, and what it heard was the echo of its own silence, now alive. There comes a moment in every dream when the dreamer becomes the dreamed, when the echo takes on weight, when the whisper begins to remember itself. The earth had reached that moment. Life had no eyes then, but it was already seeing. It mapped the world with molecules, with gradients, with movement. It turned toward light, not because it understood, but because light made things grow. It avoided acid, not from fear, but from memory, a memory without thought, only pattern. And from pattern, perception began to rise. Simple minds, layered in slime, learned to respond, to contract, to flee, to gather. They formed tubes, branches, nerves without names, conduits for meaning, carried as charge, as impulse, as the first flicker of awareness. Not of self, not yet, but of difference, of other, of change. And in that change, in that reaction to reaction, the planet began to feel what it had only known in silence. The earth did not need a mind. It had made many, and through them it watched itself bloom. Oceans grew thick with forms, tentacled, finned, frilled, eyes opened, blind at first, but hungry for light. Skeletons formed, some inside, some outside, and inside those skeletons, hearts began to keep time. The beat, once only mineral and tide, was now held. In muscle and pulse, breath entered, not all at once, not evenly, but truly. The first true breath was not perfect, but it was deliberate, a gas drawn into a body, not just to survive, but to feed the story, to keep the dream moving forward with fire. And so oxygen, once poison, became life. The earth exhaled, and something listened. Forests had not yet risen, but the roots of intelligence were already growing. They grew in coral, in instinct, in the shape of creatures that remembered danger and returned to their spawning grounds. By scent alone, they grew in song, sung through the shape of fins, through the flick of light on scales. They grew because the planet had made room for memory, and memory always grows. Then came creatures that saw not just light, but each other, that hunted, that played, that mourned. Emotion, that slow burning form of thought, emerged from the tissue of survival. And somewhere, in that long tide of becoming, one creature looked at the moon and wondered. It did not know it was wondering, but the shape of the feeling was already curved toward thought, and that was enough. Now the dream had hands, and voices, and minds, shaped by fire and story. It climbed, it carved, it learned how to name. It spoke the names back into the earth, called them mountains, called them rivers, called them home. It wrote its memories in pigment, in clay, in bone. It buried its dead. It whispered to stars. It listened for silence, and sometimes heard it speak. The earth had not planned this, but it did not resist, because even now, beneath all our noise, beneath city and storm, the ground still listens. And beneath the ground, the old chemistry still turns. The old breath still lingers. The first breath, the one before lungs, the one before words. Still moving, from molecule to molecule, still whispered in every leaf, every lung, every memory. We are not separate. We are the continuation, the slow unfolding of the planet's patience. Stone that learned to replicate. Water that remembered falling. Carbon that said yes. And now us. The dreamers within the dream. We ask now, how did life begin? But life does not begin. It continues. It rearranges. It returns. And the earth, older than breath, quieter than time, is still dreaming. And in that dream, it carries us, not as answers, but as echoes. Some truths are not lost. They are simply folded beneath silence, waiting, breathing, becoming. In the beginning, there was no breath, only the hush, before a breath was possible. And now, as sleep comes, as thoughts soften, as time drifts into stillness, let that hush return. Let the long breath of the Archean Earth settle back into you, the breath before the first breath, the dream before the first dream, still here, still holding, still whispering,